The Indian residential schools has been an issue, as you've been writing a lot in your newsletter and in the Dorchester Times, uh, as well, with columns here in the Western Standard occasionally. And it's going to be in the news scroll quite a bit right now, as we have the Pope Francis visiting right now and making a number of apologies for the Indian residential schools. Uh, what's your interpretation on how is this visit going to help towards reconciliation?
I doubt it, because the end game is not reconciliation. It's never been about reconciliation. We would have had reconciliation decades ago if that was the ultimate goal. Even the Pope admitted in his speech, in his apology, that there's still a long way to go. He said, we're at the beginning. Everybody's, first step. He said, this is the first step. My apology today. It's always a first step. There's never a second step. I wonder why.
Well, and that's part of what I've seen, some reactions too, though, with people, even if the Pope legitimately wants to end this, it's never enough. I mean, people are already saying, yeah, it is the first step, but when does this ever end? And there just doesn't seem to be any resolution. We just keep reopening an old wound.
I didn't catch the last part. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
I'm going to adjust my microphone here, my earphones, see if that helps. Sorry for that.
Oh, that's okay. If you hear me a little better now.
Look, this is only one. There have been dozens of these apologies within the Catholic Church and in other faiths for many years now, but we're still at a stage where we do not have the basis for the apology, namely the factual basis. The Pope himself admitted that in when he said more research has to be done. Why did he say that? Yet his apology accepted all of the accusations made in the 6 volumes of the Truth and Reconciliation Report of 2015, including accusations directly, indirectly, in his address about children being forced to attend the schools. 150,000 children were forced to attend Indian residential schools. There is no evidence of that. The evidence is on the other side, that most of the children who attended voluntarily, based on both the law and on the will of their parents. There was a 28-year period between 1920 and 1948. It's probably a 24-year period when Indian residential school attendance was mandatory if and only if there was no day school, Indian day school, on the particular reserve. And in fact, over the entire period of the Indian residential schools, only a third of actual children attended these schools at most. Through the entire 113-year period of the Indian residential schools, most children either attended day schools or no school at all. And even up to 1940, something like 40% of Indigenous children were attending no school at all. That is the tragedy, Corey.
Yeah, and then when you see broad-based apologies, though, and if we aren't even sure exactly what it's for, it kind of opens one up for a lot more follow-up and liability, unfortunately, though. Like, any lawyer will advise you often, I'm afraid, if something wrong has happened, if you're worried about liability, the first thing, don't apologize yet. As soon as you apologize, you're admitting guilt. And that's what I'm saying, is we're hearing activists, we're hearing others saying, okay, this is just the beginning, that they're going to be coming after the Catholic Church for more than an apology soon.
There's a big disappointment this morning, and it was since April, the April first apology, about reparations not being part of the apology. Apologies are something, but they're not enough. What are you going to do to compensate for all the damage that was done to the children? at these residential schools that you are responsible for. The underlying assumption, of course, was that there was horrible damage done to each and every student who attended the residential schools. I am the last person who will deny that some students were damaged at the schools, that some teachers were brutal, that some sexual abuse. I'm not going to deny that some sexual abuse occurred to some children at some schools during certain periods. Many of those individuals involved have been punished. Most of them were not clerical personnel. They were other workers in the school. The bulk of the sexual abuse that took place between students, as occurs in residential schools all over the world throughout human history. So, when you start off with the assumption that there was all this damage and you're not giving the proof of this damage, and you're saying, well, there's this legacy, even among people who never went to a residential school, in communities where nobody went to residential schools, which as much as Eastern Canada, there's only one Indian residential school, yet all of the same pathologies that we see among Indigenous people, high crime, high unemployment, high suicide, et cetera, high poverty, occurs at the same rate in these other places.
Yeah, and I worry that, unfortunately, even if some of it might be well-meaning and so on, I mean, when we get, again, to not getting any closer to any closure, I've been watching the coverage of it. It's been going around the clock, and I see the language and the uncorrected language of activists and others who refer to every one of them as a survivor. Even if you went to a day school, you're called a survivor, as if you'd endured something beyond what anybody else going to school does, as if somebody was trying to kill you. Or constantly, and I had that in my opening monologue yesterday, the word genocide keeps putting out there, and there was no bloody genocide. But the more we keep driving that in through the news and with these apologies, the more people get that misconception that this all happened.
What I find particularly interesting about the Pope's apology is it's diametrically opposite to what Pope John Paul II said when he visited Canada in 1985. Let me just read two sentences here. He went to, 1987. He stopped at Fort Simpson in the Northwest Territories on a particular First Nations reserve. And this is what he said about the Catholic missionaries, the teachers in the schools. The revival of your Indigenous culture and traditions that you know today is largely due to the initiatives and continuous efforts of the missionaries. Your ancestors knew by instinct that the gospel, far from destroying their authentic values and customs, had the power to purify and uplift the cultural heritage which they had received. So, Corey, what happened over the 30 years? Why is this turnaround, when it's all based on the same historical evidence, which suggests that John Paul II was quite right, that students were often instructed by priests who had learned their Indigenous language and often spoke it to them in their Indigenous language, whether it was Cree or Ojibwe or whatever, outside the classroom. Inside the classroom, just as in French immersion in Canada, you've got to stick to the syllabus. And the syllabus says it's, you're learning English, you're learning French. But outside the classroom and on events and excursions and so on, Indigenous people were allowed to speak their languages and allowed to practice their cultural activities, which the missionaries took great zeal in recording and supporting in many cases. And I'm saying there weren't some rotten apples, but the few rotten apples cannot be taken as representative of the entire barrel.
Yeah, so, I mean, where do we go with this, though? I mean, this tour is going to go ahead, and there's going to be more people looking for more compensation. Getting back to more of the interviews, as I've done with, Brian Giesbrecht and Clifton and others, and I want to keep on this. Are we ever going to finally investigate and get the facts on this, though? I mean, there doesn't seem to be will on the part of legacy media. A little bit happened with the National Post and Terry Glavin. But, people just say the mythology is overtaking the reality, and I'm not sure if we could stop it.
It's an uphill road slowly but surely, some of the data is coming out. It's all there. It's all in the archives. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission did a very sloppy job in collecting the data. They did a very sloppy job in even trying to get a representative sample of the tens of thousands of students who are still alive. They let any student come to these testimonials and to these hearings who had, most of them had a grievance that they wanted to reveal. So we're slowly getting to know that. And we're slowly getting to realize that there are no missing children. This is something that many people are now working on. We're finding them in the archives and data that were ignored by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. How can you say there's a missing child when the child was recorded as dead? The child is just dead. The child is not missing.
Yeah, and you'd corrected me on that before. I the very first time we had you on the show, because I was under this misconception that, well, there was poor record keeping and we don't know who was where and whatnot. And no, the records were actually very meticulous. We knew the disposition of pretty much every child, whether they died or went back home or whatever happened with them. But again, a lot of us are under this, misinformation that children have vanished, and they haven't. There's nobody looking for them because there's none disappeared.
If thousands of students were missing, you would have thousands of families looking for them by name of child, by the name of the individuals who are looking for them. You would have countless police reports. There would have been investigations years ago. It's simply false.
Well,
buried in unmarked graves. What are unmarked graves? You go to any cemetery in Winnipeg, you're going to find unmarked graves, or in Calgary from the 19th century, because poor people did not have money to get a headstone. They put in a wooden cross, which disintegrated within 20 or 30 years.
Oh, yeah. At the Calgary Union Cemetery, if you go to the south side, you see a big wide open area where you just see some surface ground disturbances, and that was what used to be called the Potter's Field, because there was a wooden cross put in for transient individuals or people who were poor, and the all record of visible record of it disappeared. It's not uncommon at all for old cemeteries.
Absolutely, and we have those all over the country for all sorts of groups. Not just Indigenous individuals. When students died at a school, and many died as students in a school, they were normally not buried in the cemetery adjacent to the school, which was largely for school personnel, the nuns, the priests, the workers. They've come from thousands of miles away, so there was no way to send them home after they died, so they had their own cemetery. Very few students were buried in those cemeteries. The vast majority of them, when they became ill, they were either sent to a hospital, nearby hospital, to a dedicated Indigenous hospital, or back to their home community. When they died in their home community, they were buried in their home cemeteries.
Yeah,
this is in the historical record. This is not a hypothesis on my part.
No, and I appreciate your ongoing work with this. So, before I let you go, and I'm certain we'll be talking again, because this subject just keeps going. And as I've been writing columns as well and pushing, we need to investigate. We need to look into what really happened in Kamloops. We got to get the facts out there. Where can we find your work? I know you have a newsletter and you've put stuff in the Dorchester Review. Where can people track that down?
My newsletter is on Substack, and the address is simply Hymie.substack.com.
Great. Well, I really appreciate you carrying on with this and speaking up, and I'll keep on it too, and eventually we'll find some resolution one way or another on this issue.
Thank you for having me on.
All right. We'll talk again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.